If not, this will be your place of burial. And then the people then say, we will do and we will hear, under this certain kind of duress. And the commentators on this very early midrash say, this puts a great, astonishing claim upon the Torah, because it would appear from that point of view that the Torah was accepted as a matter of imposition, of fear, and not as a matter of will. So, under what condition could people be responsible for fulfilling something that, according to the image, was duress? And then it goes on to say, but nevertheless, the people reaccepted the Torah in the time of Ezra, and it said that they fulfilled what they had accepted earlier. So we compared those two episodes. Remember that the first is like the first Sinai, in which nature is presented, imposed upon them, and then the second is a kind of renewal of hermeneutical freedom. So that the first acceptance was under a certain kind of necessity, and the second was the beginning of a freedom of the hermeneutical task. And then there was a further little episode, remember, in the Talmud. I'm mentioning all this for a reason, which said, why does it say in Scripture that the mountain was shaking at the time of the theophany at Sinai? And the answer ultimately is that the mountain was concerned, as it were, that if the people didn't accept the law, the world would turn back to chaos. And that is the reason why it says the sixth day in Genesis 1, because there was a condition made, as it were, with God at creation, that if Israel accepts the Torah on the sixth day of the month of Sivan, which is the festival of Pentecost and the revelation of the Torah, then the world would be stabilized. And if not, it would return to chaos. So part of the issue of reflecting on this is what is the import of these multiple images, and how does a phenomenological analysis of these images allow us to recapture a more primordial dimension in ancient Israelite experience? And I'm looping back to something I had said also in yesterday's class about a text with Levinas. So the first image of the mountain is a first order consciousness that's being reflected in the text. The first order consciousness is the overwhelming, superimposing power of reality that one has to submit to as a first order consciousness. The first order consciousness, before even the hermeneutical task, is to realize that the created order or the created reality is something that one has to first bend to. One doesn't impose will on the world as an initial moment, but that the mountain above the head becomes, as it were, an image of the superintending power of nature and force and reality, to which all interpretation, all culture has to respond. In other words, it has to accord itself with the reality of existence, and that the freedom of interpretation is a second order experience. So the acceptance of the Torah under those circumstances restabilizes the natural order, so that the world now becomes something solid and firm. So the first condition, we might say, of a hermeneutical theology is the first realization of the thingness or the suchness of reality, which comes as with force majeure. That's what the text said. This is moda araba, of the Torah. There's a first force majeure that one has to understand that the world has its own pre-existing structures. The world has its own order. And that all interpretations, firstly of nature, but secondly even of the cultural interpretation of hermeneutics, has to recognize that there's a prior condition. And that prior condition is the facticity of the world before interpretation. There's an acknowledgement that something that precedes, the creative world precedes the world of revelation. It precedes the world within which we create value. The whole world of the freedom of interpretation is the creation of value within the framework of the created order. It's a second order thing. Presumably, the statement that the world was stabilized means that the created order of free interpretation was trying to accommodate itself. The social world of law was trying to accommodate itself to some degree to the structures of order and the divisions of nature. Even as it tries to pick up the values of this being Tov, the Tov aspect of the creative world now has to be reinterpreted in terms of a social order in which divisions and structures are also for the sake of the good of that society. But the society has to now re-embed itself in that natural order, as if one would say the Sabbath day is a day of rest. When one acknowledges that the world is not one's own, the good of the world is to realize that it has its own existence, it precedes the human being, and the good of nature is to allow people that rest or that acknowledgement that even animals and slaves themselves are part of the creative order, and they're not simply subject to authoritarian will by masters who may impose something upon them for various social reasons. So the question then that I was thinking about since a class yesterday and also today is that the midrashic imagination, the imagination of this clustering of sources, becomes a way of retrieving a deeper phenomenological dimension of what it means to exist within the created order and to exist at the level of hermeneutical will. That is to say that Scripture as a kind of narrative statement has only given us a certain kind of formal narrative language. And the rebirth of creative images in the Midrash is, as it were, a phenomenological interpretation in the Heideggerian sense that it's going back and tapping back into a level of Dasein in the meaning of existence that precedes the level of scriptural language. It's that deeper language, and we saw that in some of the Midrashim where it says, remember, God created all these things, right? Good and bad, positive and negative, light and dark, health and sickness. In other words, there is the Scripture itself has given us, as it were, an order of expression that's at the level of social nomos. But the level of social nomos has been preceded by a deeper encounter with what it means to be in the world, what we call Dasein, the very facticity of being in the world and all of its anxieties. What Midrash does through its particular unpacking of certain condensed words, like all these things, good and bad, right? Or remember it said, in strength. So the strength could be each person's strength. It could be power. It could be a whole. Now, each of these terms become, as it were, logograms of an entire new universe, which actually releases at the level of human exegetical voice the prior level which precedes Scripture. That is to say, the deep emotional level before the level of nomos and before the level of order. There are primordial experiences of being, and that those are recaptured at the level of midrashic voice, because the people are meditating. In a certain sense, it's different. What makes it interesting from the point of view of hermeneutical theology is if you think of Heidegger's use of poetry. So he's also trying to use a kind of phenomenological interpretation on the basis of highly compressed and dense language, let's say of Hölderlin, to try to retrieve what it means to live in Dasein, to be the meaning of existence that's concealed and somehow has been captured in this primordial language of poetry. Now, one might say that what the language of poetry does is it retrieves that, but at the level of individual poetic voice. Right? It retrieves that at the level of individual poetic voice. If Heidegger's reading and other reading of the truth of poetic theology is powerful, it would mean that certain poets, like Hölderlin and others, are actually revealing something more deeply universal, even though they're saying it in their own voice. But the fact is that they're saying it in a personal voice, and if they become universal poets, we can actually, through that poetry, retrieve that primary level. What's intriguing from the project that I'm trying to express from the point of view of Jewish hermeneutical theology, and I think it would work for Christian hermeneutical theology for sure, is that we're not starting at the level of individual voice, but a person who is the agent of a tradition, who has embedded multiple levels of traditional consciousness, but has not lost touch with has not forgotten the Dasein level, and is able to bring that back to consciousness through midrashic interpretation. So if you say, what are the various levels of that cluster of readings in that text in Shabbat, it is to make one aware, firstly, that nature and creation and the orders and structures impose a first-order consciousness and requirement of God's first-order reality, that you have to say, we will acknowledge that. There's a first-order submission to the primacy of reality, of facticity, right? And then there can become the second-order search for hermeneutical meaning within that. Whether that first order is close to Torah Klula and the first order of the dimension, but it is a level that precedes, maybe the text in Tanchum, it says light and dark, health and sickness. It's closer to the Torah Klula. There's something that we have to acknowledge that precedes the language that's beyond good and evil. It's the world that's created by God, that then God may say this order is good, this is not good, the law, but it's something that precedes, and we acknowledge that first. So what hermeneutical theology does, or midrashic theology does, and it would be interesting to see how Logan is interested in the ressourcement in the Catholic Church, but it's the same issue. It's trying to go back through the sources that, let us say with Lubac, to try to tap into a philosophia perennis, to go back and to try to recapture an earlier stratum of reality that's correlated with revelation. That the ongoing meditation of revelation can bring us back to a more primordial level. And then becomes an exchange. The primordial level is retrieved on the basis of reinterpreting the traditional sources, and the traditional sources now become an expression also of something primordial, but in religious revelatory terms. So it's no longer simply the work of a poet who may remember being, but it's really people who've lived with a tradition, who use the language of tradition and through paradoxical hermeneutical reading are able to go back through a creative use of condensed terms to retrieve this deeper level, and now to create a correlation between the primordial level of being and that second level of commandment interpretation, in which one has to live at the level of religious culture. So it starts at the level of tradition, not at the level of the individual poet with a capital P, but the interpreter. Because what's being interpreted is not the world as text, but Scripture as world, right? And it's done within the context of tradition. And in some ways the result is the same, but I think it's more powerful because tradition has not been jettisoned. It still remains there through these extraordinary moments. And how, what I find quite remarkable is, for example, in the text on Shabbat, the Sabbath one, on 88, it's not just any one image, but it's the sequence of images and their internal logic, which seems to retrieve a forgotten or repressed level of what we would call Dasein. Right? That whole movement of restabilizing the world, and that's captured through the creative will of Midrash. So Midrash, in a sense, is retapping a primordial level that had been lost and is recaptured, as it were, by these extraordinarily attentive rabbinic interpreters, or among the church fathers who do the same thing at that level. There's to bring that back into the resources of the tradition, so that through the tradition we're able to recapture something deeper than what the tradition is talking about, and bring them into alignment. In other words, to bring the depths of the created world back into the world of revelation. In other words, what had been lost. In other words, when you get to the level of nomos, or the level of law, or the level of dogma, or the level of sacrament, you may forget the deeper level that the world and all of its turmoil is still there. And what the Midrash now is allowing is that deeper world that had begun at Tohu, the level of Tohu and Vohu, remember, of confusion, and then is reordered through the creative imagination, is allowed to shine back through and remain embedded in these Midrashic texts, without these texts ever losing their instructive level at the level of nomos. They still instruct the Ten Commandments, they still instruct that, but something now of a deeper primordial level is allowed to shine through. So, how this mystery works, I couldn't say, and it took me a long time to realize it, but it's a question of saying that the exegetical imagination, whether this is Jewish or would be Catholic in the same way, is not just pure play. It's not pure play. It's certain sages and teachers who have not lost touch with the primordial consciousness of the divine reality that antecedes the level of formal social nomos. And by latching on to certain words and taking them out of context, or turning certain words to create mythic images of a certain sort, the mountain over the head, or that the word all reflects all of this reality, does something that the great poets do, but now it does it at the level of religious interpretation, which now becomes something quite amazing, that the stripping of the levels of interpretation allow you to come in contact with something. And of course, for us, or let's say for me as a modern reader, that correlation becomes a renewal. It becomes a renewal of the tradition, because the tradition has not lost contact with what I, as a modern, would consider to be something fundamental, namely coming back into contact with an ontology that's a divinely created ontology, right? So anybody want to just pick up on some things? Was that clear? I mean, does that make sense? Okay, let's try. We're working at it.
The issue of correlation, to me, is a key and difficult issue. So if you think about any text, but now we're talking about sacred text, right? Like
right.
The tradition holds this as sacred, like revelatory, right? And then you have this, well, I think in the Jewish tradition too, but very clearly in the Christian tradition, you have at least the foundations of the letter. So you need to pay attention to the text itself. What is said there is revelatory. Then you have other levels of interpretation.
Right.
But then I'm thinking about Paul Ricoeur and his idea of the fallacy of the absolute text. The idea that you can there's this distanciation and appropriation, but you cannot go so far away from the text to the point that the text is not related anymore to at least the basic intention that was meant there. This is one. Yeah. So I guess my question is, there are certain passages, if we're thinking about Scripture as revelatory as a whole, that are pretty clear in their intention, even if one goes, to the languages and goes to the Greek or the Hebrew,
right,
stuff like that, where, in my view, the only way to interpret those passages in a way that's more or less comfortable to our, moral conscience now is to subvert the text using some other categories of interpretation. Right. I'm thinking, for instance, about the passages in Leviticus or Genesis or Romans or Corinthians about homosexual relations, right. For instance, right? I mean, those texts seem to be very clear. There's some nuances with Genesis, you have some nuances of hospitality, and then there's some nuances in the way you use some words in Corinthians and in Romans, but the intention is more or less clear. There is abomination here, right? There are some nuances, I said. So my question, to be much more concrete and practical, is like, the only way to kind of interpret it in a way that is not so, I don't know, like abrasive to our conscience now, it's either say, at least these lines are not revelatory, as an option. The other one is, okay, we need to interpret this kind of establishing a hierarchy of principles. Let's say what Augustine says in Doctrina Christiana 3, love for the neighbor and God is the primary key, and then we interpret the rest. And then this probably doesn't fit there, but that means that we are, not only doing allegorical interpretation, we're saying that what is said there means something completely different because intention is more or less clear. So in a way, you need to just either overlook the letter, or you need to say that the text was not revelatory in that line at least, or that something else is going on. And just to go back to the initial line, it's like, if we think that the text is revelatory, I think that's a very difficult issue. I don't know. This is a question I ask myself all the time. I don't know how you.
So let's start with the modern problem, not the traditional problem, and we have the problematic of intentionality. And the relationship between intentionality and the radical, if it's subversion or in other words, is there a deconstruction of language that's a reconstruction of the original intent? Mm-hmm. That's the way I would want to kind of repose it. So, for example, the question would be, okay, we have a description of Sinai. But what is the intention of Sinai for all those who read it with a religious consciousness and who come to that Sinai or Calvary? They read the text and they come to that moment. What becomes its imperative as text? What is the claim that would make? So you could say, well, one claim is simply describe a historical event. Well, that doesn't get you quite far, because then you could say, well, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, maybe people forgot a few details and didn't record the whole thing, or maybe you say 600,000 people can't be all wrong, but they all could be. The question of memory and how that goes. So I would say, what is happening here in Midrash? What happens in Midrash is this attempt through various vectors to capture aspects of the intentionality. So that's why we said, so you come to the mountain. What does it mean to be at the base of the mountain? What does it mean to be at the base of the mountain and to have a divine teaching come from above to below and you say, I accept it? So there becomes a meditation at one level. What does that mean? And the notion then of the mount, of that concretizing the word at the base so that you're underneath the mountain, and it becomes a kind of a mytheme, a kind of a mythologium, which is, it reveals another level of that theology. That is to say, you are under the overwhelming presence of a reality. That if you were to ignore that reality at the first level, it would be your death as a human being. In other words, you would have denied the freedom that was given to you coming out of Egypt. There's a kind of primary natural order freedom that was given to the people after Egypt, and that first level is to say, do you at the first level accept the freedom of what's imposed upon you by reality as free persons? Right? It's not yet saying the issues of the law, but it's that first level of its intention. And what some people in the Midrash are picking up on that intentionality, they have to do it by reconcretizing certain phrases to stay within the larger intention of the narrative, but to take certain terms that are now reconstructed in a way to capture a deeper truth of that, right? And that deeper truth, now here comes to that level of correlation, is also correlating with a very primary human reality, which is something we as moderns feel it's important to reconnect with, right? And so that correlation is saying that the two are in a certain correlation because the text is revealing to us something that's not just a Sinai moment, but we would say that before Sinai, the human being is also faced with the necessity to recognize the imposing character of the created world as a starting point. In other words, that's always already there even before Sinai. Sinai has simply revealed that at the level of revelation, but it's always already there at the level of creation or any moment between human beings. And Sinai has created now a new paradigmatic moment, and it's done it through this creative moment, which we might say it's not interpreting each of the words, but it's using particular words to reconstruct the deeper intentionality. And so that at the level of correlation, we are now tapped into something which is a modern interest. We want to correlate our relationship with being and our relationship with ethics and religious behavior, etc., and not to see them as discontinuous, although they may reflect different dimensions of that. So each one is able to give us a deeper purchase, but that correlation is something that's primordial. Sinai is only real because there's something expressed at that first level of imposition that's true at the first level of being a creature. Right? The notion of the mountain means that the world makes a claim upon us at the beginning. So it's true first at the level of creaturehood, then at the level of us receiving revelation. And it's true at the level of revelation because it was already true at the level of creation. And I can go back and forth. Now, this other aspect of difficult laws, where it appears to be a certain order of intention, then it's much more problematic. And one way that some moderns, or certain modern thinkers, would approximate to Augustine's approach would be to say, and it's a midrashic move, you correct Scripture with Scripture. That is to say, if, let us say, the larger concern of Scripture is to love one's neighbor as oneself, and that's a larger task of loving inclusion, can that become the larger framework in which certain kinds of more problematic materials have to be re-embedded, right? And in other words, it doesn't erase the difficult material, but it re-embeds it in a context which is a larger, we may say, a larger intention of Scripture, right? And that larger intention of Scripture would soften the harsh lines, or would allow one to look past the harsh lines for another level of love and care, right? In other words, if you didn't want to say that is a law that will just look past, but it allows one to look past the exclusionary harshness of this, because Scripture has a deeper truth of inclusion, let us say, of loving inclusion. And that would become the regulating principle that would deal with it. Now that is a midrashic way of finding what Protestant theologians would call, das Kern, the center point. You have to try to find a core principle. I'll come momentarily that certainly the core principle would be to be created in the image of God, right? So who could say that even if a person were to fall into a social category that may have all kinds of negative language about it, that they're not created in the image of God? Then what are you really saying? How do you deal with a person created in the image of God? Right? That you may have other kinds of social terms that are negative. And then it becomes a task for a community to recognize whether there are deeper principles, and this would push it back to a theological level. If all persons are created in the image of God, then there's a different order of relationship that you have to have that would allow one to kind of love through a challenging text, right? So let's say if you didn't want to, say, erase the text or put it into brackets, which, or simply say that it had a social meaning at one time and we don't even understand what that could mean, and it was addressed to a different period. But so there are different ways that one would get at that, but I'm trying to get at the level of how a deeper intention that would guide Scripture. The image of God would be one thing, loving one's neighbor is another. And then difficult texts, it would be the same way as dealing with a sinner within the framework of love, right? Right? You love the person and not the action. Will be another way of getting at that. And then you're trying to hold all of this together. Obviously there are a lot of people today who wouldn't, who prefer exclusion than inclusion, but if the task is to try for the other, there are a lot of ways that Scripture could try to do that. And that, so you have to use the text against itself for the sense of a much larger goal that might be scriptural or even divine revelation. So it gets more, but I think that in case with difficult laws, people blow these things they turn them into idols of concepts as opposed to seeing it within the framework of everything else that Scripture or the divine word is teaching. And so, if one is a traditional religious person, one wants to keep that as a regulative principle. It's not just I can interpret any way that I want, but if that's a regulating principle, and I think that every religious tradition does develop implicitly or explicitly regulating theological or moral principles, and that this would be another case where that would. So does that get a little? Yeah. So in a certain sense, there is, in terms of this issue of tradition, that one belongs to the whole tradition and then has to use its resources for the larger sense, for the ad majorem gloriam Dei, for the greater glory of God, and not for the sense of hatred or things. So every tradition will have to use those principles, and that it's a hard. I'm not trying to dodge the issue, but it's a very. It's if you want to hold on to Scripture and lots of other values and other issues that we as moderns. So then these are complicated correlations that we have to do. But getting back to that first level is that there's a kind of archaeology of the imagination that's preserved in the Midrash. And that if you follow its exegetical language, as it were, it is taking us to deeper levels of religious and human consciousness. And I think we'll have to see what Logan can find in what Henri de Lubac does, whether he'll try to go back to that as well. But I think that's part of, that'll be one move within modernity, and the correlate. What I find particularly exciting for me at one level is that you're working not at the level of the individual idiosyncratic poet, but you're working at a person who's embedded within tradition. And you are making a correlation such that the truth of reality, of God's created reality, is helping us to understand a deeper intention of the historical narrative, and the historical narrative develops a new validity by being put in relationship to these primary issues. Anybody else want to come in on this too?
My question was with regard to tradition. I mean, it seems like I'm just wondering to what degree can we really separate or differentiate between tradition itself and the primordial experience of this being, which.
Well, let's say if you were reading Exodus 20 just at the surface, you would be just seeing a certain kind of narrative description. The question is, what is its theological, what is it calling us to become aware of? Not just the narrative. I'm not talking about the Ten Commandments, so to say. But I'm just saying, when you read that text, is that teaching us something? Is there a deeper claim that very narrative brings us into, that's not just some historical report of an event that some would believe is closer to the actual way it took place, and some would say it's a remembered way. But either way, you would say it's just a narrative. What we're trying to get is there something deep, more true about that word in Scripture than just that it's reporting an event?
Absolutely, but ultimately it seems like tradition itself is. I mean, there's an attempt also in Midrash. I mean, to lead. To see tradition is rooted in that very primary one as well. So it's,
I agree. But we have to. How do you recover that? That's what I'm saying. It's not. It's this amazing moment, 1,000 years after Sinai, of living with these realities, and that these people have, some of the sages were able to come in contact with that. So I'm not saying all of them, but many of them, the ones that we're pulling out here, that are appealing. This is a modern project after all. I mean, I'm not choosing just any sources. I'm choosing sources that give me a new claim to the truth of Scripture. allows me to receive it in a new, powerful way. Right? But at that first level of narrative, I wouldn't. I'm astonished when I read an interpreter who says that, right? And I say, where did he get that? How could he read against the grain? And he gets that because he's truly in touch with a divine reality of a sort that goes past that language, maybe, or past the logos of Scripture to the logos of reality, right?
Okay. I was just wondering to what degree, can we speak about passing the language of Scripture?
But it's paradox. But it's but I'm trying to get away from the sense that this is just gamesmanship and verbal play
of course.
and a series of doing some kind of tricks on a high wire.
Of course,
right?
no. It's also goes for Heidegger. Ultimately, there's a handing down of tradition to Dasein itself, which kind of constitutes or takes a lot of what Dasein can actually project its own kind of experiences.
Right.
So tradition, place of Dasein, the most remote experience of Dasein are, in a sense, going to be intertwined, although we need to kind of get down to the core of that tradition,
right.
or that kind of inner connection to it.
So
I'm trying to kind of. I'm just wondering with regard to the problematic of the problematic, of these two kinds of dimensions of the tradition and the kind of.
Well, I'm saying with the fact. I think that for the sages, there's something about the horizon of consciousness of divine revelation that awakens in them a horizon of consciousness that's even deeper. Right? That level of coming in contact with reality itself. And since that has been plumbed at a deep level, the text somehow has opened up their consciousness to that, or they were always there. Certain religious people are always in touch with that. Then they're able to bring that back into Scripture so that you realize that the two are in a certain correlation. It's always latent there, but certain religiously inspired geniuses can perceive that correlation. Right? All right, so let's go to a different level of this. Since we've been talking, we talked also at the end of last hour, whether there are core principles that guide us. And I've said earlier that being in the image of God, and part of that image of God is the creative hermeneutical will that we create with. Let's take a look at this remarkable text in your packet from the Mishnah that appears. So in your text, that's sort of the last pages. So the last two pages in the English. Let me see if I have I want to just find the Hebrew text. Probably have it somewhere, I hope. So I want to look at this, but what we're going to see here is another aspect of hermeneutical theology, which is trying, I don't know, maybe if other people have I don't know what I did with maybe I put it beforehand.
Which page?
It's the Nazikian text, maybe. I don't. All right, let's look at the English, and I'll indicate to you what the original source is. I somehow misplaced that. If any of you have it in your computer, just call up that Mishnah. Yeah, it's in Sanhedrin 5. Yeah. All right, so let's. I don't know what happened to my. All right, let's. I apologize that I can't find. All right, so let's take a look at the text in any case. Thank you. So we were talking about the retrieval of the textual unconscious, Adrian. Sorry, you weren't. Well, let's look at here. But so maybe we'll have a way to come back to this. I think Adrian would have had a lot to say about. We're talking about using that text from Shabbat, reading it in the kind of Lebanesian way of trying to recover the midrashic depth that produced that unconscious of what that text was talking about. So now we're moving to this level of, is there a regulatory principle? Is there a regulatory principle that can guide one at the hermeneutical level that begins this process towards, it's still in the level of midrash and law, but it's beginning in this process that will lead us to remez and the cultivation of the good, right? So this, just keep in the back of your minds, right, that just as Job imposed upon Job's consciousness the ultimate reality of difference and alterity at every single level of reality, the book of Genesis highlights the fact that the distinctiveness of the human is at the level of being created in the image, B'Tselem. And that the question now is, at a theological level, how do we recapture and rebuild the theological world around a new notion of what the person is? And we're going to move towards religious practices after this, but this is still at the level of legal drush, right? Legal interpretation, but it's going to be at the hermeneutical level. So let's see how they do that. I would run down to get my Mishnah, but maybe I will. I want to just get the original text. So look over again on number 5, and I'll be up in like 1 second. I'm just get
It's not in this. It's apparently the packet from last week.
Does everybody have that packet?
I have it, but it's foreseen.
It's what? It's there.
This one, right?
So which nation are we talking about?
Nizikin what?
This is the one?
What Nizikin? Where Nizikin?
Nizikin chapter 5. Sanhedrin 5.
Sanhedrin 5 what?
Any more detail?
On the witnesses, what?
Sanhedrin what?
Chapter 5?
Okay,
Oh, I have it. Am I wanting this?
Mishnah.
a few years here and here.
What is it one, right? That's not it, right? Or it's this one? In the secret of Deuteronomy, right?
So the real issue that the text needs to deal with is, how do you reprove or warn the witnesses who are going to give testimony against another person to the absolute sobriety and importance of what it means to make a testimony against another person? What is the moral issue that the judges say to the witnesses so that they are fully aware of what it means to speak against another person that could incriminate them? How careful they have to be, and what they have to be aware of, that their language could incriminate another person. So, and it's not simply at a moral level, it's at a theological level. Right? What does it mean to say something so that another person is put into a difficult legal situation of punishment or even death. Okay? And what do you have to be aware of as a self about the other person and their absolute character, their absolute personhood? Okay? So we begin with 5. Let's someone to read that.
This one they use to prove witnesses?
Wait, maybe it should be. I didn't give the wrong. Yeah, okay. So turn to I think. Yeah, it begins at, the pages are reversed. So the last page is 387. That's why it was. Okay? So begin with 4, 5. Okay? So it's chapter 4 and Mishnah 5. Okay? So it's the last page and then the page that's preceding that's the sequence. Okay? So the question is, how did they admonish the witnesses? A person is brought before the judges, and then how are they ma'aimim? How are they really brought into full consciousness of what's implied by giving testimony to another person? So who would begin with number 5? I'd like you to read that. Anybody? Nice and slowly. Good. I think it's one of the most amazing texts in the entire Mishnah. It's really what Genesis 1 is to the Torah literature. This is really for rabbinic literature. Without this, you can't understand the whole theological centrality of personhood. So let's take a look at this. Who begins? How did they admonish the witnesses in capital cases? Okay, so what's at stake here is another person's life. And who'd like to read?
We brought them in and admonished them, saying, perchance you will say what is by supposition or hearsay or at second hand. Or ye may say in yourselves, we heard it from a man that was trustworthy. Or perchance ye do not know what we shall prove you by examination and inquiry. Okay, so the first issue is first be self-conscious of how you became aware of the so-called evidence that you're using to make a claim against another person. Right? Maybe it's just a supposition. Maybe it's just guesswork. Maybe you heard it from someone. Maybe it's secondhand. Right? Are you fully aware of the validity of what you claim to know? Because whatever you say now is another person's life is in the balance. So you can translate this at any other moral level, but they're taking the extreme case. Right? Are you aware of what you're about to say with respect to another person? And how your claim of knowledge about that. Or you may say, we heard it from a person who was trustworthy, even though, right, what is the basis of this? Did you see it with your eyes? Do you remember it clearly? Do you have corroborating evidence, etc.? Or perchance you do not know that we shall prove you by examination and inquiry. In other words, now I'm warning you to say that we're going to cross-examine you in any number of ways to make sure
that you're absolutely certain about what you think you know that will have a bearing on another person's reputation and life. Okay? So in other words, take this out of its particular legal context and see it. You can see it at any moral or ethical level, and it's taking it in extremis because it's taking absolutely seriously what it means to say something about another person. Okay, that's really the core that we're using this legal text, but it's really talking about the relationship between, or as the book of Proverbs says, that life and death is in the power of speech. Right? So what you actually say about another person affects their reputation, their life, their being. And so here this is the case. It's being done in court, but you could understand this could be done through conscience, right? Right? And you can translate this at any other level you want, but this is a court situation. No, go on, Adrian. Know you.
Know you, moreover, that capital cases are not as non-capital cases.
Okay, so now you have to also realize that there are different gradations in the law, right? This is not just another case of non-capital case where you pay a penalty or you get a fine or you get something on your insurance thing, da-da-da-da. This is something that's irretrievable, right? Okay, the implication here is not just something that you can sort of pass off with a quick check. In non-capital cases,
In non-capital cases, a man may pay money and so make atonement.
atonement is simply he makes compensation, okay?
But in capital cases, the witness is answerable for the blood of him and is wrongfully condemned.
In other words, it's as if you had killed that person. You are responsible for the person you speak against. Right? So you have to be absolutely sure of what you're saying, because whatever you do puts you into that element of judgment. Okay?
And the blood of his posterity, that should have been born to him.
To the end of the world, right? Right. So the Hebrew is that you're responsible to that person ad sof ha'olam, to the end of posterity. In other words, if you say something, let us say that results in the death of that person, you are not only incriminating that person, but that person's death deprives the world of all the progeny that would have been born of that person to the end of the world. In other words, there's an infinite responsibility. The person's blood that you would shed, however you want to deal with it at a capital case, but you can think about it in any other moral level, requires an infinite responsibility or an infinite sobriety, because it affects generations to come. Right? It's not just this person, it reflects infinite generations. And then they're going to back this up with a midrash. Right? This whole thing is going to be put into context by a midrashic reading. So what is he saying?
For so have we found it with Cain, that slew his brother, for it is written, the bloods of thy brother cry. It says not, the blood of thy brother, but the bloods of thy brother, his blood and the blood of his posterity.
Right. Okay, so just those of you who know Hebrew, they're playing on, they're concretizing something for the sake of a moral claim, right? So it says, Kol demei achicha, the sound or the voice of the blood of your brother. So demei achicha is a kind of collective plural, which we say the blood of your brother. So akim alai, cry out to me. The midrash is saying, pay attention to that plural. It's not just a collective noun, because you could read right past it. It's a collective noun. And so, demei achicha is your brother's blood. That's the way that first level of translations would do it. But they're picking up on that because they're trying to provide a moral underpinning. Why does the divine scripture say this odd phrase, Demei achicha, instead of Dam achicha? Right? Because it wants to tell that all the bloods into ultimate generation, Atzoakim, are crying out to me, God, because of the offense that is being done. In other words, there is at one level the sobriety of the admonishing judges who are admonishing the person in court, right? But at the same time, there had preceded this a deeper midrash that was aware of this. Now, this midrash is brought in because it was already at the level of a primary consciousness of the implication of harming another person, of the infinite extended responsibility. In other words, to be responsible for another person is to be responsible for all their future generations. And not just that person. That's the way this infinite, it's sort of like at the level of life, that the same sense that Hans Jonas would talk about infinite responsibility, that you have to be aware of the care of the earth for the future generations yet to come. Right? So this is awareness that anything you do to another person as a witness or as a judge ends a family line into all generations, and that those potential life forms are calling out to God. Right? Right? So this is not exactly the same way we talked about the text from Shabbat, that Sabbath text, but here too, there is a deeper moral consciousness that antecedes the reading of the text, or that biblical text is sharpened because of a moral awareness. And now there is this correlation between this moral reading of the text and what the judges are doing. And it puts it into a theological context now. It's not just at the level of a judicial admonition. It's making a person aware of the life implications of future generations at a very deep theological level. And a kind of midrashic awareness that anteceded the text. In other words, there's something that comes to consciousness before that text that allows you to see that text in this way. And this now becomes a proof text. Now here I want to pick up on something that's important. So first you read it in English, Adrian, then I want to heighten something here. Therefore, so let me I just want to get
Therefore, by a single man was created in the world, to teach that if any man has caused a single soul to perish from Israel, Scripture imputes it to him as though he had caused a whole world to perish. And if any man saves alive a single soul from Israel, Scripture imputes it to him as though he had saved alive a whole world.
Okay, I'm going to read for those just the Hebrew. I want to highlight something. This is because this is the second level of scriptural implication. The first level was to use the case of Cain killing Abel, and a kind of ethical, moral midrash that's used to underpin this legal admonition. Now you see what a second proof text is. The second proof text, it says, that's why Adam was created alone. Nivra Yechidi. Which also has to be read as a double entendre. That's why every individual is created uniquely. It's Adam the first, right? Adam in the Garden of Eden. Adam was created as a single, unique person to teach us that whoever maintains the life of an individual maintains the life of the universe. It's as if they support or they sustain the universe, and whoever destroys a life would destroy the universe. So it's tallying with the preceding one, but at a second level of a proof text. But don't forget, this is in the context of an absolute legal document. This Mishnah on Sanhedrin is dealing with courts and courts procedure. And now we're seeing how a theological, uniquely, this is not a common way that the legal text would work by bringing a midrash into a legal source. That's how important this is. The Mishnah does not give these kinds of ethical proofs. At the most, they may give a homiletical end, peroration at the very end of a chapter. But to support the absolute validity of personhood, the Mishnah, in this case, goes against all 63 tractates, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Mishnah texts, right? To introduce, so the second, now here I want you to pay attention to this issue that's going to happen here. So you have to hear the undertone and the overtone. So the overtone is Adam in Eden. That's why Adam was created alone, not as a double or with Eve, but to let you know the unique importance of every person. And now you should realize that if you harm any person, it's as if you destroy the whole world. And if you protect that person's life, in other words, you don't give false testimony, or you don't harm that person, it's as if you are maintaining, Mekayim, the entire world, because of all those under the generations. That's the overtone. What's the undertone of this remarkable text? Every individual is an Adam. Each person is created uniquely. So the very birth of it's not, you don't have to just prove it on the basis of murder. You prove it not from death, you prove it from life. The second proof is the proof from life. Each person is created, every birth is a single birth, even if it's a twin. And because every birth is a unique birth, it means each life has unique value. Now, we're going to now come to something quite remarkable. The text that's translated here is not the original text. In the original manuscripts, so here we're going to see an interesting tension. And you can already see that what the intention. The original manuscript said each person who saves any life saves the world. It has undergone a secondary parochial revision, anyone who saves a life in Israel. Now you may say, okay, well, these are judges who are speaking to Jews and it's a Jewish ecclesiastical court. But you can see already the original text was a universal text. And the formulation of this in parochial or particular terms makes sense because this is only a law that would make sense in a Jewish court. But you can already see it's a pulling back from that first universal statement by the editors of the Mishnah. And you can see from the very formulation of the Mishnah that earlier manuscript is the one that makes the most sense. Right? Now what's also interesting, now we're going to correlate some things. Now let's just keep in the back of your mind the text we had learned from the Sabbath text about the mountain and the renewal of the law in the time of Ezra. Right? It says, Kiyamu v'kiblu. Right? What they received earlier, they are now being mekayim. They are supporting and sustaining. That same verb now is not simply used in terms of the justification of the law, it's now correlated with sustaining the universe. And that was also the intention you saw in that Talmud text in Sanhedrin, that if you support the proper interpretation, the world is sustained. And so you see that same term popping up now in a total legal context, which means that the care that you have for human judgment and hermeneutics, that is to say, witnessing is also a hermeneutical decision, is not simply sustaining the universe of Torah interpretation like you saw in the text, in the Sabbath text, but it's sustaining creation. And we saw that that was already brought in by the editors of that Talmudic text, that the world itself is at stake. And now you see that same mentality at a very deep level, a deep cultural level, is now surfacing again. Right? So we're seeing how the deep cultural moral unconscious is surfacing at the level of the Talmudic text, and the deep moral unconscious is surfacing and breaking through our legal text, which is an absolutely legal text of witnessing. But you can now see something that's human all too human. The first level of the text says you have to do this to any person on the face of the earth. And then other people say, well, I live with Jews and it's a law for Jews, so I'm going to formulate it in Jewish terms. So it's true, but it diminishes the truth of the original formulation. And you see something truly cultural, right? The first text is universal. The second text, in a certain sense, is not a negative text. It still has moral responsibility, but it's a sliding away from infinite responsibility. I'm going to take care of the ones who are near me in my legal system, rather than this being an absolute law from Genesis 1, that everyone is created singly in the image of God. Okay? So it's not like this is an immoral text, but it slides away from what we naturally do if we're not attentive to our demand to be absolutely moral. We slide back to take care of those who are around us. Right? And we've lost an infinite responsibility. Because the first responsibility, Adam was created one, is an infinite responsibility for all creatures on the earth. Right? And the legislators have transformed this into you have to take care of all Jews who come to these courts, which doesn't diminish the ethical demand of it, but it diminishes the universal horizon. And we have to keep that absolute. But notice that this is all being done at the level of theological midrash that's being used to support the witnesses to a capital case where a person has been accused of something, and now it's the testimony of witnesses which is going to prove it or disprove it, right? A person can't incriminate themselves, so it has to be so-called external witnesses to the fact. Now now we're on the way now. We see this text is not done yet. It's an amazing text. I think it justifies rabbinic Judaism if any text justifies it.
Can I ask you, did we skip a line on purpose?
Did I? I'm sorry. Tell me.
The alternative reading of blood.
Yeah, I did. We don't have. It's okay. Well, we can say, we said that for a single soul, for the sake of peace, you mean?
No,
Stones. Let's leave that. It's in parentheses. It's not in all the manuscripts. It's not. It doesn't diminish anything here, and it doesn't add. So let's leave that. So therefore, a single man was created in the world to teach that any person who caused a single soul to perish from Israel. Oh, look. Okay, good. So in footnote 4, he says some texts omit from Israel. That's the best manuscripts anyway. So good old Danby. Danby was the minister of Christ Church in Oxford. This was a translation by a Christian minister. The great translation of the Mishnah was done by Canon Danby. He's a great Hebraist.
This one has Israel?
Huh?
This one has Israel on it? This one has...
No, he just has a footnote. He says some texts omit from Israel. It has the he's doing the traditional text. It says Israel. Okay. So now he is saying, let's go on. Scripture imputes it to him as though he had caused the whole world to perish. And if any man saves alive a single soul from Israel, Scripture imputes it to him as though he had saved alive a whole world. Now let's go on to a third level. Right? So this is Scripture accredits him, as it were, Ke'ilu Kiyem Olam Maleh, that he was able to maintain the existence of the entire world into future generations. So it's picking up that same tradition. Now we have another one. And another one is why, what else? Mipnei Shalom Habriot. Right? So what is another reason that Adam was created uniquely and singly? Because of what? For the sake of peace among humankind, creatures, that none should say to his fellow,
My father.
yeah, right? So no one should say, Abba Gadol Me'avicha. Now, so no one can say that they have a greater patrimony and that they have better claims in the courts. Adam was created alone and without patrimony, to say that each person alone has to stand alone in terms of their value, not in terms of who their father is or what their pedigree is or any other kind of virtue, right? It's just each individual of that. And now, let's go on. Leave out what the heretics say. Let's go on. To proclaim the greatness of the Holy One, blessed be for man. Now this is a further issue of a midrashic reading of Genesis 1 and the person created in the image of God that even deepens what we've been saying at another level. Now, all of this is part of the admonition to the witness. The witness is not only getting, I'm going to test you, but the witness is hearing a little bit of scripture to make them aware of the implications. So what's the next statement? For man stamps
has stamped every man with the seal of the first man, yet not one of them is like his fellow. Therefore, everyone must say, "For my sake was the."
But the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be, he is stamped. Yeah, right. Okay.
Therefore, everyone must say, "For my sake was the world created." And if perchance you would say, "Why should we be at this?"
All right, let's stop at this level. So now at this level, the question is, what's the difference? If a human being makes coins, none of the coins, are not all exact. What's the difference between the human being and a human and God? God stamps all people in the image of Adam, but yet each personality is distinct. In other words, this issue of absolute uniqueness of each person because they are in the image of Adam, but each person has their own private destiny. So now they're getting at that notion of the uniqueness of the individual self from another angle. Everyone looks like a human, but every human being is different into all future generations. And now, having gone through the cross-examination, the admonition, are you aware of the implication of where you got the evidence? All this theological material, the text concludes with a charge against people who want to avoid jury duty. Right? They say, I don't want to get involved. It's too much trouble. It goes back a long time, right? So it says, if a person should say, why should we be at these pains? Like, why should I bother to get involved in all of this? I mean, I may have seen it, but I don't want to get involved, right? I don't want other, I just, let's see how the phrase, he goes on to say, V'shema tomru, ma lanu l'tzara hazot. Like, why do we have to get involved in all this this legal mess? It's just. In other words, that I'm going to give testimony. People are going to hate me. I'm going to do this. It's a big bother, right? So, in other words, first they're saying of all this, and then the issue that you may know something and keep silent. So now the issue is, how do the judges say you have no right to keep silent? You have no right to withhold evidence that may affect that person. So what does he say? Was it not once written? Now they're quoting the text from Leviticus. He being a witness, whether he has seen it or known, if he doesn't utter it, he shall bear iniquity. So now they're quoting scripture again, that if a person ra'ah or shama, if a person had been a witness to something and they didn't say that, they bear the responsibility for that, for keeping silent. So now the issue is not just saying the wrong thing. Now the law of the admonishing the witness is admonishing the implication of silence. Not just the implication of saying the wrong thing, but the implication of ducking responsibility by saying, I don't want to get involved. Right? Or keeping silent. Or if you say, why should we be guilty of the blood of this man? Right? In other words, I don't want to get involved because I don't want to have to say that the person is guilty. Right? Was it not said, when the wicked perish, there is rejoicing? In other words, one has to take social responsibility for evil. So in the first case, one has to, one can't keep silent, and one has to realize that even if this is a difficult juridical decision that you have to make, you don't have the right to keep silent because you have a responsibility to fight evil. So you can see, this is an astonishing document. It's an astonishing document because at the level of law, we're going to see in a second how this could be implemented at the level of psychology, of how you train yourself in this way. So we're not at the level of remez, which is cultivating a self. Perhaps that person has to be cultivated first. But notice that this is at the level of a legal text that's using theological and legal proof texts that is trying to speak to the infinite responsibility that you have as a human being for any other human being. And so this is an instance of theological hermeneutics in a very profound way, right? Because it is forcing us to begin. In other words, I'm not using this simply as a legal document on its own term, whose power you can see, but we're trying to find a paradigmatic instance that goes beyond Genesis 1 about a man created in the image of God. That all these texts now are indicating a theology of human uniqueness in the image of God, and all the ramifications and the implications. So you can keep it in its own legal context, but it transcends its legal context, and it becomes a theological paradigm for developing a theology which shows no possibility of evading the fact of the uniqueness of each person and the responsibility that one has for culture, future generations, that one has to be careful how you speak, and that you have to speak up. Right? Now, where does the horizon of this consciousness arise? It arises beneath the level of the text. Okay? There's a whole culture that's been living with Scripture and living with rabbinic texts at an oral level, and that now this is surfacing in this text. This is not just a spin-off of the text. This is coming from this level that, I don't know, I think, tell me how you respond. It's sort of at this point, there's no space between the ontological and the ethical. There's no space. In other words, it's not as if you go from the ontological to the ethical. Or it's not that the first level in Levinasian terms is ethical. In this case, the perception of those who framed this law and this teaching have the intuition that there's no space between the ontological and the ethical. In other words, if you say that the ontological, in the terms of Levinas, is you have to preserve yourself, you have to take care of yourself, you have to feed yourself and be concerned about yourself, and then the ethical breaks past that and says you have to care for another person. The two, in some remarkable way, there's no airspace, right? By using the images that they have, the very nature of what it means to be a person is already ethical from the very beginning. You don't break past care for yourself to care for another in the Levinasian sense. Here already, the very notion of what it means to be born at the ontological level is already a theological and ethical level from the very beginning. And then it means how you speak and how you act, and your social responsibility is built into the uniqueness of yourself as a unique person. That you can't separate my unique self from my ethical, theological responsibility. So it's like Levinas on steroids, as it were. I mean, it takes it beyond that Heideggerian problematic.
Yeah. I think he would completely agree. I think you provide a salutary correction to a misunderstanding that it's either ethical or ontological, right? By ontological, means the conatus, but in women, it's all what Heidegger does with his understanding of the world, right? That we are already in a world. Levinas indeed extrapolated. We're not only already in a world, but we already are ethical. So it's not another garb you acquire, and this text proves it perfectly, that in your very moment of createdness, you already are responsible. Even though, and that's what's brilliant, bless you, even though you might be alone. It's brilliant, right? Yeah. You are alone. But the way the text reads, that being alone is in fact being responsible for everyone that might
be affected by anything you do.
Yeah. But so indeed, it shows an amazing light on Levinas and helpful to understand what we were talking yesterday.
Anybody else want to come in?
They also attempt to kind of challenge the distinction between different ethical kind of responsibilities, especially with regard to the play with the word the moon.
Right.
Which is also, I mean, blood, but also money, and especially given kind of the analogy is basically of a person coining coins and then God coining coins, which refers to v-xxii, which is may could also mean coins or money.
That's nice. Oh,
It's kind of a play between the
at a deep level, right?
I mean, it's kind of
You can pick that up. I can pick that up, but at least at the level we're discussing, you don't need that. But it's what Zvi is implying is that in rabbinic language, the demei achicha implies coinage. Implies coinage at a certain level. Right?
Mammon, domim mammon.
What?
Domim mammon.
Yeah.
Blood is also money.
Okay, yeah. That would take it another level. But you're right. But it doesn't. I think that doesn't. It does another trip on the text. But it's there. It's there, and then it deepens it at the level of certain puns. But here you can see that because all of this is related to the fact that a hermeneutical theology or any theology needs a notion of a personhood to move forward. Right? It needs a sense of what kind of a person are you trying to cultivate? What is the issue within the divine horizon of what it means to be a person? And that this text now helps us understand not just the level of intuition, but it goes back and loops back through interpretation to deepen that text. Anybody else before I go on to a different thing?
Could you please explain just a little bit more about ontological?
Ontological?
Yeah.
But what I mean in this sense by the ontological is that we participate in being. Okay, in that sense. As we're born, we participate in being. We have needs. We need to eat. We propagate. We have food. I try to take care of myself. It may lead to unethical things that I have to take care of myself before I take care of someone else. It may lead to the difference between what now they say between to be groupish as opposed to not being groupish, to care for your own. There's a whole book now about being groupish as a kind of there's a gene called the Groupish Gene that you're inclined to take care of your own as opposed to others. It's called the Groupish Gene, they say now in neuroscience. But you know people who live at two levels of morality. I act one way towards the stranger and one way towards my family or my clan, right? And as opposed to that, there is this ethical, theological level. And what I'm trying to suggest here is that in a way that's hard to put an absolute finger on, the air between the two has been removed. And that's what. So we're at a text like this goes without a text. A text like this supports an entire legal system. It supports the covenant. In other words, this text is axial. It does for culture what Genesis 1 does for a vision of universal humanity, and it still does it for universal humanity.
Yeah, that's right. I think, if I understand correctly, the contrast is between the two different kinds of stampings. One is the human stamping, which is coins, namely uniformization, which that's the danger of the law, right? It's a system of the law where everybody is equally in front of the law. That was and hence everybody's turned into some kind of legal object. And I think that's why the text.
And what God does is that everyone is unique, but everyone is different.
Exactly, and that's the pressure of the text, and that's the let's say the gravitation, the depth in which the text takes the legal issue. You say, look, it's not that easy. You can. This is the.
You have to realize that when you're dealing with another person, they're not just an abstract person, but they are a person with a genealogy.
Yeah. And that's the value of the remez, even in a legal context. That you don't just read law. This is something else we're doing here, and there's that depth, rootedness in the, let's say, level of the ethical, ontological primordialness, which has to be there.
So, Jackson, do you want to come in on this since you're in the law school? How does this make you feel?
Detached, I would say, is probably like my position. I mean, I think it's context is so much of the way that I process and think that it sort of feels pretty distant from like anything else that I would like to look at philosophy from a perspective.
Right. So there'd be nothing in law school that would bring you to remind you of your ethical responsibility within the law. Is that what you're saying?
I need to take an oath then.
Yeah, I do. I mean, we have to take an ethics class.
No, okay, no, but this is a powerful issue. How do students of the law who will serve society and you don't get a text like this, which makes you aware of what you're doing in society, right?
I mean, it's a great question, and I mean, I think that it's obviously something that we struggle with, and I mean, I know it's a joke, like, oh, lawyers don't have any ethics or whatever, but I mean, it's something that we discuss, but it's also something that we talk about a lot, especially at the beginning of law school, is the danger of getting emotional about things, because then you start to make decisions that aren't consistent with what the law is, and trying to understand, like, especially engaging a lot in, like, sort of economic perspectives, where it's like, okay, what's the best situation for people moving forward? Like, what incentives do we want, like, criminals to have, or things like that. And so, with all of those constructs and like all the body of law behind you, you obviously want to have like ethical direction. There's a lot of rules about like what's ethically appropriate, what's not ethically appropriate. But it's also, there's a little school of thought that is really dangerous to get too caught up emotionally on things.
So, but would that mean that if you come from a home with religious values and ethical values, you're learning a pragmatics and a technique in law school, and ultimately you're making decisions based on values that you've learned in the church, right? Wouldn't it's a little bit frightening at a certain level that there is such a split, but it sounds like that's a little bit the case, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think that you were challenged to scrutinize the values that we have, for sure. And I mean, obviously there's a lot of room for people to hold to those values. There's like a lot of areas of the law that you can go to. I mean, there's a lot of public interest opportunities and pro bono opportunities where people can like express their values. But I mean, if you're like sitting in a courtroom, you think, and you're talking to a judge, I mean, it's a little bit different with a jury, but if you're talking to a judge and you say, this feels right and it's like consistent with my tradition, it's not very persuasive.
Right.
And there's a difference between a practitioner of law and a witness as well, I would think, where you can understand the need of detachment when you're practicing and applying the law, but when you are evident or giving evidence to someone's faith, you want to have a different level of ethical awareness.
The weight of responsibility for the witness is what we're talking about. Are you aware that you're a human being giving testimony about another human being? And that's part of what's really coming across in spades here.
Which I guess could raise questions about all sorts of alternate sources of evidence. That at least in traditional Jewish law, you obviously don't have issues of DNA, video footage, and these kind of things. But it does raise the question of what is acceptable as evidence. You have to be conscious of the faith that you're affecting in order to be admissible.
So let's maybe look at one more thing as a way of bringing together some of the. Did you have no? I'm sorry.
Well, I'm just going to.
I'm sorry. Excuse me. I didn't. I'm sorry.
The collapse between the ontological and ethical. Do you see any of that also working in the Sinai Midrash? I think it's the Sinai. Do you see any of that collapsing between the ontological and ethical?
I think that by the very integration of those episodes, there's an attempt to see them as continuous. Right? There's an attempt to see them as continuous, but they're presented as distinct episodes. But I think that by bringing in the narrative of the sixth day and that the world is stabilized, there's an attempt, in a certain sense, to close that gap. But I don't think it's one thing or the other. It's just to see how the culture is giving it's like an accordion. Sometimes it's closed and it opens, and you have different ways in which that concern is being played back and forth, opening and closing about the relationship between the two. Because these are from different periods with different intentions, but it's interesting to see something consistent at the same time overall. And in terms of my larger concern with constructing a theology, this is an attempt to deal with a hermeneutical theology that tries to find the pivot point of the self. Now, the thing that I wanted to come to as a way of bringing some of this to conclusion is this text that I passed out today, and that there's another portion from. Well, we mainly not do the Maimonides text right now, but there's a text of Rabbi Moses Cordovero in the 16th century.
Do you have an extra copy?
Of this, I passed. There should be another one I passed out, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, down there. And then there was the other text that you would have on chalk of the palm tree of Deborah of Louis Jacobs, but the text I gave you now precedes that a little bit, and I just realized early this morning that it would be nice to look at this too, and then we'll come to this other part. So I just had this text in my office, so I didn't have the Louis Jacobs with me here. So
Jacobs translated it, or
yeah,
he wrote a book on it?
He translated, and he has a little introduction. Mm-hmm. So the issue that we just want to bear in mind now is at the level of remez, the issue is not simply to deal with theological or legal interpretation, but remez, as we're redefining it, is the cultivation of inwardness. It's the cultivation of selfhood, right? And what in medieval philosophical terms, it would mean using Aristotelian notions of ethics and virtue ethics and so on. For example, the famous 8 chapters of Maimonides, which is built on Verrois's material. There's a long, there's already an Islamic component that comes in. They get the Maimonides through the Islamic translations and so on and so forth.
What is that chapter on?
The Shmona Prakim. That's his introduction to the ethics of the fathers. Okay. So, but since I don't think that all of us necessarily live in the world of, the active intellect, or that we live in necessarily the level of the Nicomachean ethics and may have an impact, I think part of the task of a theology that deals with remez is to begin to cultivate a sense of inwardness and spiritual and ethical inwardness that is continuous with what we've been talking about at the level of universal humanity at the pshat level and at the level of the cultural self at the drash level, right? What's powerful for me at the level of remez is that it is interpreting the ethical and the spiritual task within the framework of the cultural theological demands of midrash. In other words, it provides the occasion for a person who's a cultural religious self to develop their inwardness with the language of the culture. So you can be an individual self within the framework of the universal or the cultural halacha, right? There was a place for universal humanity at the pshat level. Then you become a cultural covenantal self. And the level of remez is how do you cultivate yourself within the specific unique language of the rabbinic tradition, right? Now, the text that I just wanted to, this text of called the Palm Tree of Deborah, has two parts. This is the first chapter that we're going to be looking at here, and then chapters 2 and following will deal with the different texts. So the first text is actually a midrash on Micah Chapter 7, which is partially cited in the English on the left-hand side. But it becomes a text that focuses on the primary attribute of God is the attribute of mercy and kindness. And that is derived exegetically for this mystical teacher through a teaching of Micah Chapter 7. And by explicating this statement of divine qualities, who is like you, the Lord who loves mercy and kindness, etc., who doesn't get angry and forgives sin, that language, which has its correlate in Exodus 34, the 13 attributes of mercy, become the primary text of God's principal quality as mercy, and then there are different valences of that mercy. So the imitatio Dei is how do you activate mercy in your life. So the first chapter interprets those qualities of divine mercy phrase by phrase, beginning with the phrase, who is like unto you, who is like you. That's the beginning of Micah 7 verse 18, Mi el kamocha, who is like you. And it explicates each one, and then it says, how does a human being imitate that divine quality? So in other words, it's not just to be in the image of God, but to activate the image of God whose primary quality is loving kindness. Okay? So the absolute quality of God from this point of view is loving kindness, and it expresses itself in multiple ways as it flows down into the world. And to imitate God, imitatio Dei, means that you have to live out loving kindness yourself in certain ways. So what I want to first just do, look with you, is a couple of passages about this from the point of view, the first 2 pages, or the first 2 or 3 pages. Then I actually, since I wanted some of you to have some of the Hebrew, I overlapped a couple of pages from the Jacobs where you can see the Hebrew as well. Okay, so the first text, so now I'm just going to read it to you so that you can see how this is going to. So it first says, who is like unto you? Who is a God like unto you? Okay, so that is now going to be interpreted. What is the particular uniqueness of God that this teacher is trying to express using all kinds of other aspects that God is a God of mercy and loving kindness. So he says that this refers to the Holy One, blessed be He, who is, now I don't think, the translation is not a good translation, who is a tolerant king. Now the Hebrew says Melech Ne'elav. He's humble. The greatness of God's majesty is that His majesty is expressed through His humble comportment to all things. Who bears insult in a manner beyond human understanding. That is, sovel elbon. It's punning on ne'elav. In other words, we're going. Let's actually read the text first, and then I will explain. Without doubt, nothing is hidden from His view. In addition, there is not a moment that man is not nourished and sustained by virtue of the divine power bestowed upon him. Thus, no person ever sins against God without God at that very moment bestowing abundant vitality upon him, giving him the power to move his limbs. Yet even though a person uses this very vitality to transgress, God does not withhold it from him. Rather, God suffers this insult, that's the humility, and continues to enable his limbs to move. So this is a kind of an astonishing teaching of God's creativity, the relationship between divine creativity and grace, what we would call. The relationship between creativity and grace, which we would call mercy, is that God the Creator, the bestower of life, never withholds that. Even if creatures take the gift of life and the gift of creativity and use it for sin or for perversion or misdirect it, the gift of life into the earth continues. In other words, the very vitality of a person being able to have the energy to steal or to rob is the gift of life that God has given. The gift of life and mercy is never withdrawn under any circumstance. So it becomes that first level of the theologumenon. The first theologumenon about God is that God bears all the indignities of what might be the perversion of God's gift of love and grace and kindness and vitality, and doesn't withhold that even if persons misuse it. So you might say, at the level of earth, God continuously renews nature and earth, even though we screw it up through ecology. Right? The gift of life is continuously given, even though we may deprive or harm or kill other people. The gift of the vitality of life never ceases, even though a person may kill, rob, or maim another person. In other words, their very life is part of that ongoing divine. Now, God doesn't only give life and goodness and care for the world for those who acknowledge God and return that gift with proper loving kindness. Now, ultimately, we'll see the task is, of course, to acknowledge that. But the truth of divine mercy is that God gives, and what we would say it's a pure giving. It's an absolute pure grace. So to say that God as creator is pure grace means that the sources of life and nourishment come into the world and never cease because they are misused. Now he says, go down to the bottom. He says God never withdraws that vitality, but now go to the very bottom of that last paragraph on page 6 and the Hebrew. This then, how do you imitate God in this way? Right? How do you cultivate being in the image of God from the point of view of this virtue? And that's absolute pure creativity, which is God's alone to give. It is a virtue that a person should emulate. Harei zo midah shetzarich adam lehitnaheg ba. One has, this is what we'd call habitude. Lehitnaheg is what the philosophers call habitude or habituation. This is what you have to cultivate. You have to turn this into a praxis, right? Right? Or what Aristotle would call a hexis, right? This is the hexis. How do you turn this into a habit and a praxis? In the Greek, it's hexis. Right? That is to say, how does a human being do it? Remember, God was soveil. He is able to withstand the abuse to divine creativity without withholding it. The human response is savlanut. It's playing on the same tune, tolerance. That is to say, the ability, it goes on to say, even when a person is insulted to the degree mentioned above, he should not withdraw his benevolence from those upon whom he was so. This is a human being. V'chein heyot ne'alav afilu lamadriga zo ve'im kol ze lo yesov tovato min hamakabel. That is to say, the human praxis of hexis from this theology of pure giving is that the human being has to give as is required in any circumstance, even if they are insulted or the gift is misused. It doesn't mean that you can do it right away. You have to cultivate that. But this is that first task of being in the image of God, who is the pure giver of all life and vitality. We can only do it at a certain psycho-moral level, that to the degree to which we care for those we love, all the people we come into society, and we do it even though it is misused or we're mocked or it's misappropriated. And we do our best to keep giving even though the gift is not acknowledged. Right? I love you no matter what. Right? That becomes the way that you imitate God in human circumstances. Well, what the church would call charitas, right? It's a kind of overflowing, gracious giving that is done without expectation and keeps giving. And so you get it through God's grace and through the imitation of God. And that is the deeper meaning of tolerance. In other words, withstanding all that comes against you even while you're giving. And in other words, the task of becoming a giver, of being a makabel, to the makabel. In other words, your kids go off the path and they do what they need to do, and you keep loving, right?
I find this somewhat radical because it actually implies that what conditions the tolerance of God is basically the sin of the
what?
What conditions the tolerance of God, what conditions in the present day is basically the sin of the people, of man. Because God could be tolerable. I mean, tolerance of God is conditioned by the fact that it's actually tolerant.
Yeah, right. It's paradoxical in the sense God gives vitality to creation when He creates the world. And the sources of energy, even if in other words, how do you get at the depths of the truth of God as pure giver? By saying that even if the pure gift is misdirected, God keeps giving. The source of life is continuously given, even after war and disease and plague and human perversion. Right? That's a mystery that the teacher is saying that's the first level of cultivating being in the image of God. On the point of view of enacting a virtue. Yes, Lynn.
Yeah, I just wonder, in the scripture, the clearly conditional grace as well, as reflected particularly in the Book of Deuteronomy. Maybe if you do this,
Right.
if you do. I'm just wondering, how do you see these two things as hierarchical? Like God fundamentally is an unconditional giver, but understood, or do you see these contradictory to each other? I'm just wondering how do you put these two things together?
Well, from the point of view of this teacher, and I would accept it, that this is a supreme teaching. This is a supreme teaching, and the conditional notion that if you do this, I'll reward. That is a kind of maybe a lower level of teaching a child. And many of the medieval commentators, at least Jewish commentators, would say that's in Moses. Moses says that, and God doesn't say it. And Moses is functioning simply as a pedagogue who's trying to give a carrot and a stick, and that this is really from the other point of view. Okay, so that, in other words, you have to, obviously there are different levels of how do you cultivate virtue at people at a level of reward and punishment. Maybe the first level that people need, so they don't, and then another level. But now this is not taking this at the level of these conditions, but now he's giving us a theology of the purity of God's gift as creator. And the gift of creation never ceases, and it has even no matter what a human being does. Now, the text that I gave from 30 simply it's dealing with a later point in the discussion, but I just wanted to give it to you so you can see it develops a little more. A person should also conduct himself according to this attribute. That's this attribute of repressing bad feelings if a person is insulting you, so that you keep on giving. He should not suppress his fellow's virtues, but remember the evil. In other words, a person is called upon to find the good in the other and to keep their mind focused on the good of the other, even if that person has been doing negative things. And that should be, and you should. And so part of the issue is to erase the memory of the evil and to focus on the good, so that one can become a bestower of good as well. He should not detract from this good in his heart, saying, although he did me a good turn, he also did me bad, therefore forgetting the other person's qualities. In other words, it's finding something of the good in the other that one can focus on to stay as a bestower of the good. If it's difficult for you, you have to find there's no person who hasn't done some good, even if it's the fellowship among the transgressors, right? They have the loyalty, right? They have loyalty among themselves. In other words, there's some quality that becomes a good quality, and that has to be the enhanced quality of the gift of the good. Now, the other thing that I just wanted on 52 and the next 2 pages continues that kind of issue, and that's part of what the latter part of this whole text from the Tomar Devorah is dealing with. In other words, it gives us a very different notion, let us say, of the face of the other, or the face of the person that has to be cultivated. So it's saying that what you have to do is cultivate your eye to see the good. You have to cultivate the ear only to hear the good, or to support the good. You have to cultivate the nose not to become angry, the mouth only to speak the good. Now, it goes through the entire, since the human being is created in the image of God, and then they have this kind of notion that the human being is, God is a kind of anthropos, in the image of God, the human being. Part of the way Cordovero develops this is to go through all the features of the body as a way of cultivating the good, to see the good, to have the benign eye, not to have a worried expression on the forehead, that the ear should be in a certain way. When it comes to the hand should extend goodness. When it comes to the feet should go to the people in need. That the hand should be open as opposed to closed, etc., etc. In other words, it helps you to say it's not just a matter of the mentality, but the mentality has to express itself through the features of the face, the movements of the hands, the body. You have to go to the place where the needy are to give them the food, to provide the comfort. In other words, it's enacting the hexis. It's enacting this, and that becomes the way that we, in our limited, finite way, bring the good of God into the reality of the world. And to emulate God is to try to keep the good flowing, even though there are innumerable ways that would affect us psychologically, emotionally, or other people that try to block that. And that the task then is to cultivate the image of God to continue to be a channel, right? In other words, that the human being in the image of God becomes another channel of that pure vitality of life that flows into the other person. And that becomes that task. So from the point of view of, and all of this is developed hermeneutically, right? Through a reinterpretation of Micah Chapter 7, which is considered to be a mini version or a different version of God's attributes in Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7, right? God is merciful and loving kind, which is again the attribute of flowing mercy, overcoming insult, right? This over al pesha is to overcome insult and care, so that one is continuously overlooking insult, injury, and becoming a conduit of the flow. And then the chapters then make the daring move from these being abstract virtues of God being the giver, the pure giver, to saying that if the human being is the human image of God, and so that God, in a sense, is the structure of the human being, it uses the structure of the body as a way to activate these particular virtues through all the things that hands can do that feet can't do, to hurry to do the good thing, to bring gifts to the poor with the hand, that the face always has to be calm and with loving radiance, etc., etc. So in other words, to see ethics in theological terms as a flowing of grace. Yeah. So anyway, I just so what's powerful here again is to see it's an exegetical theology. It's using phrases to deepen a theology of a certain type, namely in this case a theology of bountiful kindness, and then to see how God enacts that into the world. And then the task of the human being is to find places within the brokenness of the world so that becomes an expressive virtue. And so it kind of works towards the fulfillment of the self as a creature. So in a sense, so these are the actions that become part of the redemptive process, that begin to fulfill creation by the human being filling that lack in creation, which may be expressed through the perversion of sin that breaks the flow of creation, the human being becomes a divine agent to increase that flow that is always coming from God in any case.
Could we argue that in the Torah we have somewhat also sod level encoded?
How would you say that?
As even at the ethical, especially in this text, right? Because, I mean, 56, 57, right? In the middle, these are eight qualities, all of which come under the banner of humility. They all correspond to the supernal limbs of Keter. So he takes it all the way into Keter. So which is meaning because through ethics, right? Ethically.
For Cordovero, the highest level of the supernal gradations of God in the pleroma, Keter is the highest level, and it has the 13 attributes of mercy by themselves before they flow down into the 13 levels. So it's in other words, the highest crown, everything is structured around mercy and kindness, and then they flow down through the emanational gradations in other formations of mercy. But in its purest form, it's mercy above the qualities of mercy. It's the purest mercy, even above the pleroma of mercy, even before it enters the world that we have to activate. So you're absolutely right. I didn't want to get into that, but the very structure of the divine is the mystical structure of the flow that comes down from divinity in the most supernal way. And at that level of Sod, or the mysterium, is that the infinite nothing of God first breaks through into this cosmos through mercy. It's always overflowing its containers, and it flows down. Now there may be, so in a certain sense, the redemptive process at the level of Sod in mercy is the rebinding of every human person to help them fulfill the structure of their body, right? In other words, and the ultimate redemption is the maximum issue of shalom or peace in the structure of every human being. Now, if every human being, from this point of view, is in the image of God, but at the level of human life, there are any number of levels of psychological or social brokenness or disconnect where the flow doesn't happen. And if the person can't do that on their own, that's the task of those who can get to that level of imitatio Dei, to go to the other to help unblock the flow, or to help heal the eyes, the nose, the hand, the stomach, right? And the healing of each person then becomes one more step in the mystical magnitude of healing a broken universe, in which that divine flow has been, there are any number of social disconnects that human beings have broken that flow. And so it all becomes a cosmic process of what the church would call restoratio in integrum, right? It's returning everything back to its original wholeness. But it's only done mouth by mouth, stomach by stomach, hand by hand, grace by grace, so that each person is able to be fulfilled at the level of receiving the divine beneficence. And only when this becomes an absolute fulfillment could we talk about redemption, because in a certain sense it completes the perfection of the divine that has flown into the world.
But ethical performance then becomes a reenactment of Keter, right?
Yes.
So that's the ultimate
What you activate at the level of ethics is the perfection of God's pure giving at the level of Keter. In other words, it's not only that God in this world has 13 attributes of mercy, which we would call providence. Those levels of providential, providence is mercy. It's not just at the level of judgment, right? It's understood as pure mercy. Above that is the divine pleroma for Cordovero. The 13 levels of mercy are the 13 gradations within the divine pleroma. What the Neoplatonists would call the emanational levels. But at the very highest point, at the level of the divine will at Keter, Ratzon means goodwill as well. It doesn't just mean will, it means good desire. And so it comes from that level of absolute perfection, right? So it's a perfection above perfection. In other words, so you might even say in the absolute Kantian sense, everything depends on goodwill. Right? It's at the lowest level, it's goodwill that's activated by the purity of giving. The mystery of the divine language, at the level in which the divine will of kindness emerges in Jewish mysticism, at this level of Keter, which is the crown of the pleroma, is called Ratzon. Right? Or the Reuta de Liba. It's this highest level, and that level is it plays on a term that Ratzon is also not just will, but it's good desire, it's care. And so the beginning of the overflow is the care that the divine will should overflow into reality. And then it's a question of the return of that through spiritual consciousness. And then the whole task of religion is to become aware that we're recipients of the gift and to turn that into spiritual energy or moral energy. And in that process, there is a healing. That's the issue of tikkun, the reparation or the healing or the rebuilding of the brokenness, which has been broken by its misuse, social or spiritual, or however, at all those levels in which the world is broken. By the misdirection or the misuse of God's gifts. And that becomes that task. So you're absolutely right, and I'm glad that you brought that in. I'm always reluctant to talk about Sod in public, but that's part of that. That's the mysterium. And that is the integratio or restauratio in integrum, what the church would say. It's the returning of that back in the Jubilee, everything back to its original source. That's when it flows down, and the restoration, in Neoplatonic terms, is the bringing of all of those back up to the primordial wholeness, which is unsayable because it's ultimately the divine name, which is the name of mercy. Okay? We can't say it because it's the ineffable name, which is ultimately the logogram of mercy. So it's very deep at that mystical level, but even at the purely human level, it's pretty profound as well. Yeah. So this would correspond, presumably, in Christological terms, of the God, Christ as the cosmocrat or as the giver, that's flowing down at infinite levels of logos, and kindness and giving, and charity and grace become expressions of that purity at the deepest level. It's charity as the ultimate dimension that then flows down, and then you know it in what we would call, in our world, through what we call logos, through forms, articulations, structures, etc., etc.
Where is Gor in this picture? I'll let you read the whole text of Toma Devorah,
but in other words, what he's saying is, where is restraint? Restraint has to be mixed with mercy at certain kinds, and he has a hold. So we only looked at a small fragment, but there is a dimension in which love and restraint has to find its right balance. Right?
It is there.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've reached the end, which I guess is a beginning. I want to thank you for the attentiveness and the participation, and I've thought new thoughts, so I have to thank you. And for the rest, these texts, I hope they nourish you and you take them in whatever different direction that they work at. In the meantime, let them flow into a final paper. When you're ready. Already from some that I've received, you should. It's an integration both of content, but of personal statements as well, of this whole issue of tradition. So don't feel that it has to only be. If you want it to be purely intellectual, but you can also feel to kind of bring that into your kind of integration of your own thinking as well. So I wish you a good summer, and we'll see. I hope we'll see everybody in the fall, and if I'm in during the summer, that'll be good too. I wish you all peace and good things. Okay. Thanks.